Another Comp 1501 lecture. As usual, let's just dive into the lecture as fast as we can and see what we get through. Have more time for discussions. So first, last time, what did we talk about? So in Monday's lecture, we were talking about the various different emotions that we experience during gameplay. So the two kind of semi-unique emotions, but really key ones for us to understand, being flow and fiero, or flow being, can we maintain ourselves within this flow state of we're not too bored, we're not too anxious, we know what we're doing, we're overcoming challenges, and it's kind of a almost meditative state where we're in the zone. And then we also have fiero, which is this feeling of triumph. Grading criteria for our assignments, we want to be feeling fiero. We want to feel not just fiero for the victory of the game, but we want to feel momentary fiero. We want small accomplishments over the course of a game. Then we talked about motivation theory and the different ways that people get motivated. We talked about operand conditioning or extrinsic motivation, and I am stretching the definitions here a little bit, but operand conditioning with Skinner boxes where we had the rats that when the green light was on and they pressed a lever, they would get food. When the red light was on and they pressed a lever, they would get shocked. And very quickly, they learn what actions are needed to take to get the rewards they want and which actions lead to what penalties. And the key insight here is that operand conditioning and extrinsic motivations, while they're very, very effective at building up the mental model for the player, so they are very useful tools for providing a mental model to the player, we also learned that they don't really entice the player to want to take those actions. They want the reward, they dislike the penalty, but they don't end up actually trying to take the actions themselves. Or they don't want to take those actions if they didn't have the rewards coming in. Now, in contrast to that, we also talked about intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is where we get into competency, autonomy, relationships, and often in games, we also see this desire for sense pleasures come up. Now, the intrinsic motivators are the reason that we engage in doing anything. We talked about MDA, or mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And this is another similar to the elemental tetrad. We have the same thing here with MDA, where we break our game apart into these major pillars. But in this case, we look at it from the mechanics, which is a very big blanket term that can include a lot of stuff. It's the time, like how turns work, it's the space that you play it on, it's the objects in the game, it's the resources, it's the actions you take, it's all of that stuff, pretty much all of the structural elements that we described live in the mechanics. We have the dynamics, which is what happens when the player actually starts working with those mechanics and when multiple mechanics start interacting with each other. And then we have the aesthetics, which is what the player actually ends up experiencing. It's the type of fun that is evoked. And we tend to think of the aesthetics almost like a painter's palette, and how can we design our game to meet certain aesthetics, or if we notice, if we discover that our game is promoting certain aesthetics, then how can we reinforce them more if the players really want those aesthetics, or conversely, where we have aesthetics that we actually don't want in our game, and the players are experiencing them, so we want to get rid of those. So MDA is a really, really fundamental, I would say more fundamental than the elemental tetrad. Certainly more people consider MDA in their professional life. So I want to do an example of MDA, and we're going to be using Monopoly. Now, I'm aware that not everyone knows how Monopoly works, so we're going to watch a brief rules overview and then do your best to figure it out. Now, what you can do, whether you know Monopoly or not, is to follow along while you're watching this and write down all of the mechanics that you see. Think about the rules, think about the space, the time, how time works, how space works, what rules there are, what objects there are. There's a lot of stuff, so write down what you can, but try to write these down and consider them as we go, and feel free to put it in chat as well. So that brings us to what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be continuing our discussion about player motivations, and we're going to talk about how we can apply that to playtesting and how we can use playtesting to better understand how our players are actually being motivated. So we might be wondering, why we bother to invest so much time and effort thinking about aesthetics, and why we would classify different players as having different motivational profiles and all this stuff. But for us, we want to advocate for the player. So it makes sense that we need to know who our player is to adequately advocate for them. As a designer, you are not just possibly, but you are likely designing a game that you yourself don't need to be incredibly excited about, that you might be working on a genre that you really don't play in your everyday life, but you still need to be able to advocate for players who do enjoy that. There's this kind of wonderful saying that every single game is somebody's favorite game. So if you can make your game really, really good for that somebody, then you succeeded. And we need to know who we are trying to motivate to adequately motivate them. And once we understand all of these, it goes back to that harmony. We really want all of the elements in our game to harmonize. So if we know the primary motivations, then we can continue to design features that harmonize with those motivations. So the very first thing that we want to do in any game project is establish our experience goal. What do we want the player to be experiencing? Whether that's interesting mechanics, so we can take a mechanics approach and say we want them to be able to play with these really fascinating mechanics, or we can take it from a story or narrative approach. And either way, whatever we're doing, we need to take into account the player's expectations. If they think they're coming into an extremely narrative game and it's very systems heavy, then they might start interacting with the game as if it were a narrative game and not a systems game, which is going to shift the dynamics that we had originally intended. If we have players coming into a very heavily systems driven game and they start making a lot of decisions based on role play and narrative, they might not be able to progress in the game because they weren't playing with the systems as they were supposed to be. Again, it shifts the overall dynamic of the game based off of their expectations. So we must know our demographic when we're making a game. This extends to many, many different things. Making a game for a small child is different than making a game for an adult. Making a game for somebody who is at different levels of education, or at different levels of games education. If we have somebody who has never played games before, then we have to design a very different game. So we need to know who our game is for. So today we're going to be covering 3 different major motivational profiles. These are the ones that I see coming up time and time and time again, with Quantic motivations being the kind of newest of all of these, but the one based on empirical data. So we have Bartle's taxonomy, which is one of the early ways of breaking down players. This was really to make broad generalizations about your demographics. So this was intended specifically for multi-user dungeon games, kind of old MMORPGs in a way. And it was intended for these games. It wasn't intended for games in general. It was just meant for these. So it makes very sweeping generalizations, and it's really useful for classifying the dynamics that we want to have in the game. But by no means should we see it as kind of the end-all accurate descriptor. It's nice for shorthanding. Now we have the LeBlanc aesthetics, and this is allowing us to see our mechanics through a player perspective and to kind of understand this harmony of all of our different aesthetics. It helps us balance our aesthetics. So this is about trying to label our desired player experience. This is about helping us label the experiential goal more than anything. So while that lets us consider like how might these players interact with our systems, while Bartle's allows us to do that, we have MDA allowing us to consider how these different aesthetics might play together and how people might be experiencing these dynamics once we get past it. And then finally, we have Quantic Foundry's research, which is an empirical breakdown. They have surveyed hundreds of thousands of players over the years, and they've been able to rank these after doing a really big literature review on all the different motivational profiles. And they are really digging deep into these different stats that they've been able to pull, deep into the different types of players that are out there. And this is used for market research. It's used to just better understand player motivations in general. So we're going to look at that briefly as we go. But it is a pretty dense topic. So I don't want you to think you have to memorize every aspect of it. Now, one that is quite easy to memorize, and it's a good one for conversation. So let's talk about Bartle's. We have these 4 quadrants where we usually put players for Bartle's taxonomy. We have the socializers in the top left, we have killers in the top right, explorers down there, and achievers over here. So in chats, just kind of consider what game mechanics do you think appeal to each of these? Make sure to list like, oh, the socializer likes this, the explorer likes this. And I'm just going to put some up here. So this is kind of a combination of mechanics and dynamics here, but here are some things that are going to get them excited. We have the socializer might like trade and guild management, but just like when we talked about the aesthetics, a socializer might be into streaming. An explorer is going to be into brand new game mechanics popping up and being able to explore how those mechanics work, spatially hidden areas, and coming up with interesting and new complex strategies or having customizations. We have the killers, who are primarily interested in PvP dominance or dominating economies in a game, really just destroying the way that resources work for everybody. And this is where a mechanic like being able to taunt other players comes in. It's appealing to these people specifically. And we have our achievers, where we see things like high scores, leveling up, winning the game, and, well, achievements. All of these things are going to appeal primarily to achievers. And again, we aren't going to put people anywhere on this specifically. We aren't going to say that this person is exclusively an achiever, but you might be able to say this person's more of an achiever or this person is more of a socializer. Now, when we actually graph this out, what we're really seeing here is that we have these 2 axes. We have people who would prefer to play with the world, like the in-game world, and people who would prefer to play with other players in some respect. And then we have people who want to dominate that aspect of the game, people who want to dominate other players, who want to completely dominate every goal in a game. And we have people who want to work with it and who wants to kind of cooperate with it. So we have the socializers and the explorers who kind of want to work with the world and see what it has to offer instead of trying to impose upon it. Now, it's a very, very straightforward tool. It's a really easy way for us to make a broad strokes generalization. We look at a mechanic and we say, that's really more of a socializer mechanic, or that's really appealing to killers, and I don't know if we want to appeal to the killers for this game. And it's useful for that, but it doesn't accurately describe players. It's too general to accurately describe players, but it's incredibly helpful in conversation to say, hey, we really don't have any killer mechanics. We probably don't want to include anymore. It might get in the way of our other aesthetics. Now, when we get to Quantic Foundry, we have some different stuff. So Quantic Foundry is not as simple as Bartle's. It's a little bit more complex. There's a lot of subcategories, and every year we get more data and more subcategories. So I'm not going to be actually evaluating you on any Quantic Foundry stuff. Just it's too much for you to have to memorize. But if you are interested in learning more about this, there's lots of GDC talks freely available on YouTube, and you can check them out. Just search up Quantic Foundry. You'll find all sorts of stuff where they go into all of this different demographic data and all the fascinating stuff that they've learned about how players are motivated internationally and across different demographics. Now, in a nutshell, Quantic Foundry studied hundreds of thousands of different gamers through these online surveys, and they aligned them to ocean personality types. This is the big 5 personality types. These are, I think, the most accepted in academia as being accurate personality indicators, outside of other stuff that's maybe a little bit less academic. And they were able to, with this kind of combination of stuff and with all of this data, build up a really, really strong demographic data across many different axes. And what they did after doing a big literature review and pooling what everybody seems to accept are the common motivations in games, they were able to see how they relate to one another. They were able to see how these different things actually work with one another. Instead of just saying, this is an aesthetic, this is an aesthetic, how do these aesthetics harmonize? How do people who like certain aesthetics, do they like other aesthetics? So that's really what this one is trying to pull out, is can we build a profile for a game based off of its motivations and based on the people who play that? And can we build a deeper profile for each motivation to understand who else is there? And maybe it's important to note here that this is a very proprietary model. This is used by this company to do counseling for different companies. So keep that in mind when we're talking about this. It is a proprietary thing. So this is what the model looks like, or at least this is the simplified. Yes, this is the simplified model for Quantic Foundry. The more modern approach, after a few years of research, actually then goes deeper and has each of these individual components like fantasy or power or challenge. Each of these is actually a spectrum, or I think maybe even multiple spectrums. So there's a lot of detail here if you would like to go deeper into it. But for the most part, it's broken up into these 6 broad categories that have 2 axes on either side, and maybe axes within that. So we have action, we have social, we have mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity. I think these resemble the core aesthetics that we discussed quite well. These resemble a lot of what Bartle's has to offer as well. And I think being able to memorize at least these 6 broad categories isn't too bad. It's just a little bit more than Bartle's, and it's very close. We have our achievers, we have our competency people. I mean, we actually kind of see right here the intrinsic motivation factors, right? We have competency, we have relationships, we have sensory, and let's see, do we have that autonomy anywhere? Well, kind of the entire thing is autonomy in a way. That's games, but creativity more than likely would sit there. So we have a lot of competencies being hit here at the high level. And in each of those, we can break it down much deeper. So we have immersion. You might be more interested in the fantasy of it, but you might be more interested in the story. And you can be interested in both, but to say that you enjoy immersion doesn't imply that you like story. You might like fantasy without story. That's perfectly viable. You might be into mastery and enjoy challenge, but you don't like strategy, but you do enjoy the challenge of it. Or you might enjoy strategy, but you don't want it to be challenging. And those are perfectly valid. And I think being able to break these things down like this helps us to see that each of these motivations is more complex than we might otherwise give it credit for. So one of the interesting insights that came out of this research is this grouping, this clustering of these different motivations. So what they did was they took all of these different players and they had their profiles and they said, okay, which ones do you have in common? And they mapped it out in this space. And we do see, and maybe it's not surprising, but it's useful to have empirical data on this to show us that we have these 3 major clusters. Over here on the left, we have this kind of creative cluster. We have story, design, and fantasy. So we have people who play the game to get into this false world, or to be able to express themselves in a new way and roleplay and be creative. We have the mastery section up here. That's all about completion, strategy, challenge. So mastery, achievement. Down here, we have the excitement. And probably one of the coolest insights here is that people who are really into the destructive and exciting stuff also tend to be people who are into community and competition. So we kind of see how dominant this killer mentality must be, and how close it likely is to the socializer. I think this shows us how much of a blend there is between this social play. And then we have the bridges. So people who are into excitement and destruction and community and competition, they're all about power dynamics. Whereas the commonplace between the mastery achievers and the role players, we get discovery. Both of them like exploring and trying new things. So by looking at these bridges, we might actually be able to support multiple player types a little bit easier in our games by having bridge mechanics. So very interesting stuff that you can apply to your games, that you can think about in your games. But once we start thinking about things like making sure that we have bridge mechanics for the different motivations, we should probably be pretty deep into our considerations for our game. We don't want to be thinking about these up front. But if we want a little bit of a shorthand again, we have just tiers upon tiers with Quantic. We see the immersion creativity cluster, the mastery achievement cluster, the action social cluster, and we have these bridges here. So this might be a useful just shorthand for you to have next to you and consider when you're designing your game and when you're trying to think about your target demographic. Then you can try to think, okay, let's just target the action social cluster, or let's target the immersion creativity cluster. And if you want to do some kind of bridging, you have that available to you. And this is to say as well, this isn't to say that action social like power less than these things. It's just that it's equidistant between these two. Like both of these people like it at the very least, or we can make that assumption. So we're going to do a little activity here. I like running this one every year. So we're going to be doing a trailer breakdown, and we're going to watch this trailer as a group and then go off and try to discuss what the trailer was trying to get across about the game Path of Exile. So we're not going to be thinking, if you've played Path of Exile before, then put that on the back burner and just try to take a look at the trailer, because what I want to do is see how the marketing material wants to talk about the game, not necessarily what the game is, but what is the marketing material trying to say about the game? Who are they trying to target with the marketing material? And after that, we're going to go into breakout rooms for just a couple of minutes and talk about the motivation summary. So we've got our taxonomy, our MDA, and our motivations. At the very least, I want you to try thinking about taxonomy and the MDA, or Bartle's taxonomy and LeBlanc's MDA. Think about those ones. Think about what you saw for that, and we'll be able to talk to one or two groups when we get back just to get some quick insights and have a little bit of discussion about it. And of course, you can chat in chat as well when we get back. So I'm going to play this and get some breakout rooms organized and write down stuff as you're going so that you can jump into discussion right away. Oops. Okay, so at this point, let's just take a moment to regroup and consider what we have learned about making games so far. So thus far, we have discussed how we need to start simple, we need our game to become rough, and that good games are refined over time. They don't start amazing up front. We start our design by thinking about the structure. And this is one approach. We are going to be talking about a alternative approach soon, but we want to start by thinking about these structural elements, especially right now as you're getting started. So we want to think about the structural elements. We want to think about goals. We want to think about the overall outcomes, victory and loss conditions. We want to consider the actions that we need to do to get there and the resources that are required to perform those actions. Keeping in mind that resources are just anything that the player values. We have obstacles that need to be overcome, and ideally those obstacles are a chance for them to either learn a new skill, or it's an opportunity for them to showcase a skill that they have in a really interesting way. So the obstacles aren't just there to be tough, they're there to do something, to motivate the player and be exciting for them in some way. We discussed how from this structure, we end up with a dynamic experience. We design all of these mechanics. We have a lot of mechanics that we're going to put in place, but then from there, the player engages in it. They start working with these mechanics, and it becomes a dynamic process that we can't control. We try to control it, but we can't control the entire experience. And we discussed how we can make those things meaningful by using intrinsic motivation and all of these different aspects. And with these motivations, we learned that what it means to be meaningful to a player changes from player to player. It changes based off of what they experienced coming into your game or what they expected coming into your game. That's all going to change based off of what they personally find meaningful and what they want to engage in. So we have to consider different players differently. Now, very importantly, throughout this whole time, we've been repeating this over and over again, we can't evaluate an experience that we can't experience. Or another way, we can't judge a game that we can't play. Or another way, we can't understand our player without actually observing our player. All of these things are important. We need to do. We can't just think, we can't just consider. We actually need to start making and thinking about and playing our game in order to properly think about it. So that brings us to prototyping. which really we've been talking about and doing this whole time. We might make many, many different prototypes and pick one of those that we find interesting, and that is the start of the game after doing a whole bunch of them. You could spend this entire course making a game a week, and by the end of the course, you have a big selection to choose from, and you can think, well, which one of these do I want to pursue? Or do I want to pursue something similar? Do I want to try evolving this idea more? So we need to consider, how do we actually pick an idea if these prototypes are intended, if we're intending to make a ton of these different prototypes? Well, there's a few different things that we can consider. These are the 8 filters from Schell. You don't need to memorize them, but consider these when you're making your game. Does the idea just feel right? Does it click for you? When you have an idea that is maybe good, it needs to feel right. If it doesn't feel right, you're going to have a really hard time empathizing with your player. So make sure it clicks to some extent with you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good idea. That's just one factor. Now, if you can get through that, we move on to the next one. Who is the intended audience? So think about your demographic, think about your motivations. Once it clicks for you, try to understand how it's going to click for other players and who those players are. Now we have this kind of tough to judge one, but is it well designed? This is just, have you taken the time to be mindful of your design? Or have you put together some stuff that you say is cool and then you haven't actually taken the time to look at it through your lenses, to evaluate it through all these different things that we've talked about? Does it offer something new? Does it have any novelty? Does it have any hook that's going to bring a player in and get excited about? Or is it just the same experience that they've had over and over and over again? Now, if you've made it through this many, then we can ask, is it technically possible to build this game? And this is actually, once we get to the 5th filter here, we can start to tweak. If we know we have a really good idea, it's offering new gameplay, we have a target demographic in mind, all of this stuff, by the time we get down to here, we might consider reevaluating the idea that we already have, not necessarily coming up with a new one, but if we can't technically build this, then is there a way that we can still make a game that hits all of these first filters? Because by the time we've gotten here, we probably are onto something. And then finally, we're going to ask, do players actually like our game? And there's a few more kind of production filters in the textbook that you can check out, but the final filter really is, do people actually enjoy this game? So once you've made your way through each of these one after another, and you make your way to the bottom, put it in front of players, and if they don't like it, it's not a good idea. And maybe you have to refine that idea more to make it a good idea, but there might just be a point where you have to accept that as much as you thought going through these filters it was going to be good, if players don't like it, players don't like it. Always remember that when you are picking a goal, when you're picking a player experience goal, when you think you know what you want the players to do and you think you know how you're going to get there, that is hovering somewhere in space. Like, it's this little goal off to the corner. And the first time that you make your very first prototype and you go into your very first playtest, you might think that there's this clear-cut line from here to here, and that's where you're going. But then you get some new feedback. And what you want to do is not try to twist that feedback so that you can keep this path to your goal. You want to move your goal a little bit. You want to see, okay, well, the feedback is aiming in this direction. Now your goal is somewhere around here. And then we get more feedback after that. And we realize, no, it's a little bit closer to here. When we're designing games, we tend to think of it as finding the game. We're trying to uncover the fun. We're trying to discover what makes it interesting. So we're just putting our knowledge out there and seeing what comes back. We're not trying to control this whole experience. We're trying to discover what makes it an interesting experience. So think about it as a discovery. Think about it as an exploration of a space, not trying to define this space up front. And that our goal is always shifting. So if we want to have this shifting goal, if we want to get feedback in the same way that we're running the game loop for players, if we want to update our mental model and get our feedback, then we need to make lots of prototypes, and we need to understand what makes a prototype separate from other games. So a prototype is intended to be simple, small, to the point. It's supposed to test one particular thing. It's supposed to test one aspect of your game or of your project. And specifically, we're trying to test some kind of risky part of it, something that we're unsure of or could break our project down the line if this doesn't succeed. Now, rapid prototyping is key to the iterative process. The ability to make something and tweak it and adjust it and get feedback and tweak it really quickly, that's key. And that's why we typically start with low fidelity prototypes like paper or just role playing around a table. We want to have some sort of artifact, a recorded roleplay session or some paper that shows that some risk is being mitigated, that risk isn't as bad as we thought, or it is, so we have to change our idea because that was too risky, and I'm glad we answered that question early. So you don't want to commit to it being perfect at this stage. You're just trying to identify risks and try to sort out what's going wrong. So let's take a look at a few different prototypes. So I want to play the trailer really quickly for Mario Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Not the whole thing. So just a little bit there. So this is a tactics-based shooter where you navigate around the maps and hide behind walls, take cover, and you have like probability for will this attack hit, will it not hit, will the enemy hit, will the enemy not hit. And this was the original prototype for this. So it was a bunch of laminated sheets of graph paper, sticky notes, and people with little like amiibos or figurines that they were using. And why would they do this? It's because it allows them to refine all of the mechanics in the game. It allows them to test the level design without actually having to sit down and build out a full level. It lets them test out how different actions occur. Because really, you can play this pretty directly in a tabletop version. There's no reason not to do it as a tabletop game. And when we see something like this, there's some really nice insights. There are some GDC videos that I can try to link, but when you're making paper prototypes, they don't need to perfectly replicate the gameplay. They don't need to be one-to-one matches for what the player is experiencing, but you can approximate it. You can find ways to achieve the same dynamic through a different mechanic. So one example that they provide is if you're simulating a first-person shooter, then rather than trying to represent okay, you're facing this enemy, how do we judge whether or not you actually hit the enemy? There's places you could go, there's all this. Well, you play Dungeons and Dragons. You say that each of us can move so far, so the enemy would move this way because we wrote a script for how the enemy moves. That's the basis for our AI. And we know that the players usually have about a 1 in, or maybe a 4 in 5 chance of taking out an enemy, and they die about 1/5 of the time. We could just make that assumption. Maybe we've played some other shooters and we're trying to represent those dynamics. Whatever it is, you make a guess, and you can play that shooter filling in all of your skill checks with rolling dice and seeing if it's successful, and then understanding what happens if it is successful and if it isn't successful, and trying different strategies and seeing how they affect things. And you can just base it off random chance instead of skill because that's easy. There's all kinds of interesting things you could do to simulate your gameplay in lower fidelity ways. And that's a skill that you will always be working on. I'm still working on personally ways to represent the digital continuous experiences that I want in paper form. It's a very useful skill if you can build it up. Now, another way that you could do, I've been talking about roleplay a lot, and you might think, well, that's crazy. Why am I just going to sit around roleplaying? Well, this is how they designed the AI for Watch Dogs. So, no, really, you can't just kind of roleplay things and make use of them. So, we've talked about risk. What does risk mean? And we will talk a bit more about risk before reading week, but we can put it down into a bunch of different categories. At a very high level, we can say, is our game fun? And that's okay, it's not fantastic, but early on, you might be asking, is this mechanic fun? And we want to see that. Or what is fun about this experience? So very early, it might be pretty general like that. Can we make it is definitely one that you want to ask early, and you might prototype very specific aspects of your game to see, can we actually do this? Like, oh, we want to make a game where the character is blind and they send out little pulse waves. This is something we did for a game jam. But do we know how to send those little pulse waves out? Do we know how to do the collisions? You should prototype that really fast so that you don't end up coding a game for 6 months or something only to realize you have no idea how you can do that mechanic that you've been leaning on. Will it sell? Can we afford it? All of these could have prototypes associated with them, where you want to have something that you hand out to people and get feedback from. But it can get very, very specific, and it should get very specific as you go. So we see Spore, for example. They've actually released all of the prototypes, or many of the prototypes for Spore, publicly available, at least the digital ones. So we can see 14 different prototypes, each testing each specific system to see how the dynamics work, to see how the implementation works, to make sure it's technically feasible, that it's fun and interesting, that it looks interesting. So if you want to check out some of these low fidelity prototypes that were used to create a game like Spore, then they're all available for you. And you can see that they don't resemble the final game. They aren't intended to look like the other game. It's testing the behavior that's going in the game. So it has a really low fidelity representation. It's testing the technical feasibility of something. So that thing might seem very accurate to the game, but it doesn't have any of the surrounding context of it. It's just that one specific system. So prototypes can be kind of broad, and early on they will be quite broad. Is this game fun? What about my game is fun? But as you go, you'll answer more specific questions like, can we have 50 characters on screen at the same time? The way that we actually assess a prototype, thinking about the game loop, because that's what we're doing here. We have a mental model. We think this is going to be fun. We think it's technically feasible. Now we need to take action. We need to figure out what kind of a prototype we want. We run it through playtesting. We run it through a set of procedures and rules. That's our playtesting. And then we get feedback back that updates our mental model and adjusts our new goal and lets us know what we want to do next. So the kind of 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, we can see that in games as well. But in almost any creative space, we're going to call that 99% revision instead, because that's what we're doing. We're creating a really quick draft and revising it and revising it and revising it. And by the end of it, we've created something new, something that might not even resemble that initial creation, that initial inspiration. So now it's worth kind of drawing a difference between a few things. So there is quality assurance, and quality assurance is where we play the game, or we have a quality assurance team playing the game, specifically looking for bugs and just breaking issues in the game. This is when we're looking for technical fixes, but that's not what we're talking about with this form of playtesting. Now, there's also internal reviews when the actual team itself is playing the game to discuss the feasibility of features and just kind of go back and forth. That is a form of playtesting, but it's more important to separate it from playtesting. It's important to say that this is an internal design review. This is not playtesting, because playtesting is about understanding what our players are experiencing. So playtesting helps us understand what external players are really experiencing, and not just us trying to use our design skills to push us forward. That's what we do afterwards. Now, playtesting sucks. It's a bad feeling. No matter how far you are in the game industry, it's not that fun. You really are inviting people to tear apart your game as much as they can. Ideally, they're saying things in a positive and constructive way, but you're inviting them to say bad things about your game. So it can be very deeply uncomfortable, but it is necessary to the process. It's important to view negative feedback as a way to improve your game. Positive feedback validates decisions, but negative feedback provides you with ways to improve. It provides you with the questions needed to improve. So we want to challenge our assumptions, and we want to keep the mentality that, yes, it is starting bad and it's getting better. We are growing a good game. We are discovering a good game. So of course it's going to be bad up front. Of course we're going to get negative feedback up front. If we get negative feedback up front, then we have good playtesters. So once we've decided that we're ready to do testing, then we need to pick our testers. So there's a few different options when you find your testers, but ultimately what we're looking for in a good tester is someone within our game's target demographic. You can go slightly outside of your demo for different purposes, but mostly try to stay in your game's target demographic so that you get more accurate information about how the players playing your game are going to experience it. We want somebody who can clearly articulate their feelings while playing. We need someone who can actually express themselves, who can play and talk at the same time. Now, we can work with other people, of course, but it's very helpful to have someone who can articulate themselves. And finally, we want someone who could provide honest and unbiased feedback. We want them to be able to express themselves, but we want them to be able to express what they're actually feeling about our game. And that's going to obviously sway who we want to be recruiting for this process. So, for example, developers, well, they're convenient. We have our dev team and we can do our internal review, or we could pull people who haven't really been working on the game directly and have them experience the game, and it is more of a playtest. But there's pretty obvious issues here. You get fixated on certain aspects. You've already been tunnel visioned on something for a long time, so it's already in your head. You're not getting a first time experience out of it, and they just might not be able to see this as a player. They're too deeply invested. It's useful. It's absolutely useful to do internal reviews and have kind of other people play test within, but you're not going to get the same kind of results as you do from an external tester. Now, and this is also, by the way, the order that you are likely to end up testing your game. So you'll start by testing internally with the devs, and then you'll move on to the friends and family. So it's really easy to get friends and family on board. It's easy to call them. It's cheap, typically. And they will continue to give advice long after the test. That's pretty useful. They'll contact you again and say, hey, I was thinking about that part of your game. And you can get some more info. And you can bring them back to show how the game's evolved, and they'll be able to give you some feedback on the direction of the game. So being able to get some feedback on the direction that you've been taking is also pretty cool. It's useful. But they likely won't be very negative to you, and that's underlined. Unfortunately, they aren't going to criticize us as much. Unfortunately, they aren't going to be negative, because we really do want them to have some negativity. We want to see where we can improve. So then we have our QA team. These are recurring play testers that are usually on payroll, or we're contracting with an external QA firm. This is really good for finding bugs. And these, again, similar to the friends and family, we can get recurring advice about the overall direction of it. Like, yeah, that did decrease the difficulty. Yeah, that did make this section more interesting. But it can be expensive, and it's not really ideal. I think we can say that the ideal for testing is, what does somebody coming to the game for the first time experience? But there is value in having people who can test the long term of your game. If we have people who are playing the game for the first time, they can only play for 15, 25 minutes. Whereas having a long-term QA team, they can tell you about the long-term progression of your game. They can experience the game for 10, 15, 100 hours and let you know what the end game looks like. So short-term people, tissue testers, very, very good for FATUIs, or first-time user experiences. They are random people that we pull in and we never use them again. We just bring them in for the first time, see how they react to the game, and then we don't let them see the game again until it's released if we can avoid it, or maybe very, very long term. Later we bring them back in. They provide the least bias. They are not going to come back, so they're likely to be quite honest with you. And if you have a series of tissue testers who all report the same problems, then it's very easy to highlight that as a real problem that's coming up. If you have a lot of people coming in and saying that the narrative is just getting in their way, they can't stand all of these narrative pop-ups coming up. If you have 2, 3, 4 people all saying the same thing, then you know you didn't just get one tester who really hates narratives. So it's really easy to see all of that. But of course, they aren't going to be able to give you long-term access to your game. And this adds a bit of a practical note here. A first-time user can only be a first-time user once. And that means that early in your process, you might be excited to bring in a bunch of first-time users, a bunch of tissue testers, and get everyone to check out your game. But you can exhaust, as a small indie, you can really exhaust your pool of first-time users very, very fast. So be mindful about your testing approach. Consider how fast you want to bring in testers, because if you exhaust your entire tissue tester list immediately, then you're not going to have any later on when it's maybe a bit more important. So what we want to accomplish is a general structure of testing early and testing often. Now, while they aren't ideal to have recurring testers, while it's not ideal to have the devs and friends and family testing, those can provide us really good early testing that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get if we were being very careful about our tissue testers. So absolutely, as soon as you can, test, get your friends and family involved, get the devs involved. If you want some more information about playtesting, you can read the chapters in the textbook. Excellent overviews of it. Every company, every individual approaches playtesting a little bit differently, so it's nice to get some different perspectives on it. But effectively, we end up with a structure around this way. We welcome people, we introduce ourselves, and we want to mention that thinking aloud helps us. We want them to be saying, all right, so I want to be doing this. I'm going to try and find this button. Okay, it looks like this button is going to do this for me. So I'm going to click on that. Okay, that didn't do what I expected. I thought it was going to do this, but what's happening? We really want them to express their thought process while they're playing. We want to effectively have them verbalize the game loop. So if we can get them to think aloud, we want to ask some basic demographic questions. We want to know what games they play. Are they part of our target demographic? We just want to suss that out as much as we can. We want to mention that the game is in active development. It's not close to finish, so don't worry about what you say. Everything is subject to change. We just want to express that this is flexible. It's subject to change. It's in active development. So the reason behind this is if people see something incredibly polished, if they see something that they think is finalized, they're less likely to provide critical feedback because they don't think there is anything that could be done to change it. So we explained that the game is in active development, and we probably also want to recommend that we aren't trying to test the skill of the player. Instead, we're just trying to get general feedback about what the experience is like. And certainly, I've run a number of playtests where we've had people come in and they get so self-conscious about not being able to play the game well, and they think that they are playing the game poorly, but really we just didn't tutorialize them, or we had awful feedback in the game, or we just made the level too difficult, and they think that they aren't skillful enough for the game. So we want to express that we aren't testing their skill, we're just trying to get general feedback about the experience of it. Now, once you actually start the play session, we want to be quiet. We don't want to be interrupting them. We don't want to be answering every little question because you're not a part of that Steam download. So we don't want you to be describing every little way to approach the game. We want to know where they get tripped up. We want to know where we can provide additional information in the game itself for the next playtester. If they're absolutely unable to progress, then we can help them out of it. If they want to keep playing and they just can't go forward, then we'll help them out, get them to the next section, and keep going. And we want to be paying attention and taking notes on absolutely everything, and designating different people to take notes on different aspects of the experience, like how usable is it, how fun is it, or what things are they trying to do that they can't do. If you have different people paying attention to different aspects of the playtest, it's a lot easier to pay attention and take notes on everything. And then finally, you want to have a little bit of a closing discussion, or at least provide them some sort of a survey. And early into your playtesting, you're going to be asking general questions just about the gameplay experience. But the further you get, you're going to be asking questions more specific to the risk that you're trying to evaluate with that prototype. Did this aspect seem fun? Which of these did you prefer? Anyways, a lot of specific questions about your game, but that develops over time as you actually get more specific questions. And you may want to collect contact info at that point so you can send over a key to the game when it's done being complete. So these are a few. I've got 2 slides here with just some useful questions. I personally use this one pretty much every single time that we run a playtest, and in this order. The order is really nice for it. Effectively, we're asking, what was the most frustrating moment? What was your favorite moment? What was something you wanted to do but couldn't? If you had a magic wand to wave and you could change, add, or remove anything, what would it be? Describe what you were doing in the experience, and how would you describe this game to your friends and family? And the order of this matters. We start with what's frustrating because most players are nice. Most people don't want to offer negative feedback in my experience. So I always start with what was the most frustrating part. and they have a ton to talk about, even if they've been so positive through the whole playtest experience. When you ask, what is the most frustrating aspect? That word seems to do something. They start talking, and I've had them talk for 20 minutes after being silent for a whole playtest when I asked them what was frustrating. And you get a lot of feedback that way. And then you ask what was the favorite part. And they feel good for saying what they liked about the game after going off about what was frustrating. So we ask what was their favorite moment or what was the favorite aspect. We don't ask necessarily just what did they like, but saying what was your favorite moment lets them hone in on something a bit more specific. Was there anything you wanted to do that you couldn't? And this is distinct from waving a magic wand, because was there anything you wanted to do that you couldn't? Well, I wanted to get up on this platform and I didn't know how. And it's like, okay, that's good to know. But if you could wave a magic wand and add, change, remove, whatever it is, they tend to go really huge with it and radically revise the direction of your game. So if we allow them to wave that magic wand and change anything about the game, we might actually find a whole new direction for it. They might bring up usability things that we hadn't considered at all that they thought were way out of scope for the project. So they didn't bother saying it. So it's a very useful one to have this magic wand descriptor. We ask, what were you doing? Because this might surprise you, but a lot of people might not even recognize what genre they're playing if you didn't set it up right. So having them describe what they were doing helps you understand what their mental model looked like when they came out of the game. And it might not be what you think it is. And then finally, how would you describe it to your friends and family? That gives you Steam descriptions. That gives you your elevator pitch. That helps you refine your pitch. And that helps you understand, again, what their mental model is. So where did the game loop break? Where did the game loop go particularly well? How would they make sweeping adjustments to your game? And then what does their mental model look like by the end of it? So that's really what this one's getting across. And then we have some more questions here, which are all kind of more specific versions of those or slightly different. I think the key ones that differentiate it, what was the objective of the game? That's a very, very, very good one to ask. I think I do like that one a bit better than what were you doing? It hones in on it. What was the objective of the game? We have, is there any information that would have been useful to you before starting? A lot of the frustrations that people experience, that is one of the key frustrations that they express. So it's good just to get that out of the way early and say, like, what information would have been useful to you? What was frustrating? And they're probably going to say, oh, well, I have talked about that with the information that was missing. And then, was anything confusing? Now, again, this is probably going to come up with frustration, but it's a useful one to ask if they didn't get to that. So have these questions on standby in case they didn't answer them with the initial 6. Now, when running a playtest, there's a few quick tips we can follow. Avoid leading the player. So I've had playtests where people have actually, in this, how important the game is to your grade, I had that happen at a playtest before where we were talking and they were saying, oh, this is for our final project in our course and it's really important that we get good feedback. They asked that before starting the survey, or said that before starting the survey. So they led me to say that this was going to be a good game so that they would get a better grade. Don't sit down and explain it because you aren't a part of the Steam download. So don't try to explain the whole game to them. Don't explain every little piece. Maybe provide them what they would get on the Steam store page, and that's about it. Notice the things that you don't want to see. So if you aren't looking for negative feedback, if you're seeking positive feedback, then you're going to miss the criticisms. So this is where having different people looking at different parts of the game are important, and making sure that you aren't ignoring failures, but using those to kind of fuel you going forward. You need to take the blame. Very important when you're acting as a designer of anything to take the blame for it. So if they don't use your product correctly, then you didn't design it so that they would naturally use it correctly. When you make a game and they aren't doing things in the game that they're supposed to be doing, then you as a designer need to find ways to get them to do what they're supposed to be doing. It isn't that they're wrong, it's that you can possibly find ways to make this work more generally for everybody. And a really useful one is to ask questions with more questions. Remember, we are trying to get data here, not provide data. So if somebody says, what does that blue button do? Then rather than just telling them, let's get more data. What do you think the blue button should do? And then they'll tell you, and they'll say, oh, well, I think it's going to be taking a screenshot. And you can write that down and say, maybe that blue button should take a screenshot, or maybe we need to change what this button is like because they think it's a screenshot button. But really, it's not a screenshot button. It's much worse than that if they press it. So we ask questions so that we know why they're asking the question in the first place. We're constantly trying to dig into the root of why they're asking things. If you think you are ready to playtest, then you're already late to the playtesting. You want to test things while they're in active change, and generally, it's just a psychology, and I fall into this all the time. When you are actually rapidly changing stuff, it feels too rough to hand out to other people. Even if you know that it needs to be rough to be playtested, you still think that it's too rough. You can't test the part you want to test, but there's more stuff that you could be testing. And by the time you've put 10 dominoes in place, if that first domino wasn't good in the first place, well, all the other ones have to get thrown out too. So start early, start with as few dependencies as you have so that you can remain as flexible as possible. The goal of this is not to have them tell you they love it. You want to try and better understand your game. They're going to provide you with feedback that is probably a bit nonsensical. Feedback that when they say it, they're approaching it from the context of other games. And if they say they love it, then that doesn't tell you very much. That tells you, okay, maybe you're onto something good. But you want to better understand your game. Your game. And they're approaching it with knowledge of other things. You need to dig into it to understand how it actually affects the experience that you're putting in front of them. Now, with all this, it's, I think, important to have a small discussion on imposter syndrome. This isn't going to be tested or anything like that, but when it comes to playtesting, we often think that we aren't good enough to showcase our work. We often don't think that, or we get extremely anxious and self-conscious about it, and everyone does. I mean, even AAA designers hate to showcase their work to other people because they're just afraid of what the response could be, unless you can really learn to love it. Now, this is a very common experience pretty much everywhere, and I don't think you'll be able to go the next 10 years without hearing somebody talking about imposter syndrome. So let's just get out of the way now, and you'll have a better understanding of it in software and game dev. Now, this is a shared experience across pretty much all of us. At some point, you feel like a fraud. You feel like at any moment you could be found out for not being as smart or as talented as people think you are. You try extra hard, or you may try extra hard and face constant anxiety for not trying hard enough. You may not actually go out and seek help because maybe seeking help will make you discovered and people will suddenly realize that you're actually an imposter and you don't deserve to be here. You're not as good as everyone else. So you have this constant looming anxiety, these fears, this doubt that prevents you from getting started or pushes you to go beyond your personal capacity. Now, this is very common in new workplaces where you go into a new workplace and you haven't been fully trained, you're not experienced with this, so you start feeling incompetent. You don't have the prerequisite knowledge. You don't know if you can solve the problems that are that you're facing. We see it in class. A lot of people refuse to put their hand up in class because no one else is putting their hand up. And if no one else is putting their hand up, then everyone probably knows it. But really what tends to be happening is a lot of people want to put their hand up and they don't see anyone else doing it. So they feel like they must be the dumb one in class. That's completely wrong. From being on both sides of the classroom, most people just want somebody to put up their hand and ask that question. Nobody's doing it. So just be aware that in classes, you are not behind. I mean, you're probably not behind. And if some people are standout and ahead, that doesn't make them the typical. Now, we also see this a lot in creative fields because we get this feeling where we can't accept positive reception. And I think there's some interesting reasons that we see this in creative fields. Maybe more so than some other ones. And if you understand the root causes of this imposter syndrome, then it does make sense that it would pop up in things like creative fields. I mean, let's think about where all this comes from, or what we can do about it. So the first step to overcoming your imposter syndrome is that we have to learn how to accept positive feedback. We all feel this. So if we're all feeling this and we're still providing each other positive feedback, then we need to start accepting that and use that and integrate that into our mental model when we receive it. When we get positive experiences, we should use it to grow, to say, okay, that is good. I can accept that that's good and press on. When we get negative experiences, we should learn from them. We're using the game loop, right? I mean, if you're playing a video game and you lose a life, then you try to do better next time, and we happily accept that. But when we do something good, when we get a massive score boost or we get a crazy upgrade, then we try to do the stuff that got us the upgrade. And we need to think about how we are individually affected by this, because everyone can be affected by it differently, and it can change how you act accordingly. So Dr. Valerie Young proposed these different categories of imposter syndrome, and you can fall more or less in multiple different categories. So we have the perfectionist. You worry about how things get done, and basically one flaw in an otherwise perfect thing kills your sense of achievement. It kills that fiero. We have the superhero. That's all about how many different roles can I juggle. You might be a student who is involved in way too many things. You might be working at a job and taking on every single duty that comes your way. And if you even fail one of those duties, even though you took on so much, then you're a failure, or you feel like a failure. You're the expert. You must know everything. You have to know how everything works. You have to know every aspect of it. And if you don't know how each component is working, then you're a total failure. And this comes up a lot in the games industry, where as a designer, you do have to have a bit of knowledge in everything, but you also need to let the experts in the field go off and be the experts in their field. So you have to toe that line between, yes, you do need to know a little bit of everything, but you have to let the experts actually know everything in their specific domain. So it's really easy to fall into this one as a game designer. We have the natural genius. You need to be able to master something with ease. Otherwise, you don't think that you did it, that you actually mastered it. If it doesn't work on the first try, then it's a failure. If you didn't learn it quickly, if you didn't do it quickly, then you're a failure because it didn't work well. And then we have the soloist. If you had to rely on other people to help you for something, then it's shameful. If you needed help, then that evokes shame. And this is probably one of the more common things that I see across student bodies, where you don't go to your office hours, you don't raise your hand in class, you don't think that you should be getting help because no one else seems to need help, right? So all these different categories can pop up in different ways, in different places, but understanding that these can be symptoms of this thing can help you overcome it and adjust your behaviors a little bit towards that direction. And like in creative fields, I mean, we're constantly being critiqued. That's the heart of playtesting, is I'm going to put something that I know is not great out there and get critiqued. So we're in a constant state of critique. We're comparing early prototypes to AAA masterpieces because we tend not to see the AAA prototypes. We only see the results of 6 years and 600 people working on something for 40 hours to 80 hours a week. And we're comparing ourselves to all that. We're comparing ourselves to the 5 indie gems that made it huge this year. So it's a little bit better, I find, particularly with this one, to spend a lot of time in game jams, to spend a lot of time looking at rough games, to watch Let's Plays of poorly made games, and realize that those ones that you're seeing, that's the end result of the process, and you're just all the way at the beginning. So don't be comparing yourself to those big ones for sure, but we always are. So there's always something in the back of our head that can make these arise. We know as game designers that we only improve through failure loops. We learn by reinforcing skills and messing something up and then doing it better next time. So if we learn through failure loops and we have this innate push towards, oh, I can't be a failure, then that's really going to make it difficult to improve your work. And a lot of game designers, a lot of game developers are self-taught. They got involved in the industry on their own at some point, in software as well. A lot of programmers got their start self-teaching. So you didn't have an adequate kind of validation. You didn't have adequate feedback for your mental model, so you don't actually know how accurate your mental model is. And that can cause a lot of self-doubt in what you're doing. So key thing here with imposter syndrome, you're definitely not alone. I think the statistics show that 70% of people will experience imposter syndrome at some point. So you are absolutely not alone in feeling imposter syndrome, and you might feel it in a lot of different places. Definitely feel comfortable asking questions and getting feedback. If you don't feel comfortable doing it, it's part of the process. And do your best to start accepting questions and feedback and accept getting help, because we need to do that in order to grow. We need to be able to see this stuff to improve our games and to be more creative. So it's easier said than done, but these are the sorts of processes that we want to move towards. We want to start moving towards being able to receive feedback, being able to ask questions, getting help when we need it. Now, I do want to, on the subject of getting help, this is not mental health advice. Imposter syndrome can be extremely and deeply distressing for people. So this is not mental health advice by any means. Please, if you are feeling any kind of distress, check out Carleton's mental health services. There's a lot of stuff that you can look into there. And in fact, you can get counseling to maybe help you through some of these feelings if you're going through them. But know that they are perfectly normal feelings that people encounter, and you can do your best to overcome them. And you might need help, so reach out for help. So, summary of today's lecture, the key points of today. We talked about Bartle's taxonomy as a way that we can classify socializers, killers, explorers, and achievers, and it's just a broad categorization for us. It's not the ultimate way to sort people, but it does help us talk about our mechanics a little bit more from an aesthetic perspective quickly. We have the Quantic empirical research, which gives us plenty of aesthetics with subcategories and how they all relate to one another with those kind of action, social, mastery achievements, and creative immersion clusters. This expands on, I guess I'll put it here, this expands on LeBlanc's taxonomy of aesthetics that we covered in last lecture for MDA, which is also a valuable tool when looking at these motivations. We see how demographic information can be valuable for us, both for playtesting and for just determining the core motivations for our game. We use prototypes to help us answer questions by making them small, quick, and flexible, and assess a very particular type of risk. We have to playtest early, we have to playtest often, and we have some tips to playtest a little bit better. So thanks, everybody, and have a good weekend.